by late 1993, we got our first graphical browser called Mosaic. As soon as I saw Mosaic, I knew the world was changing. And everyone, it wasn't really an insight on my part. Everyone saw that, and now they said, okay, here's this mainstream application of Gopher, essentially. And that's when I started building websites. My sites looked like this in 1993. CGI bin, written in C. You can see the HTML is embedded inside a C program. This was not very convenient. If I wanted to just change a little bit of HTML, I had to recompile my program and redeploy it to the server. So other people figured out that this was not ideal. And in the Perl world, there was something called CGI PM. So a Perl module for creating CGI programs. It's a little bit better. This is the same program, essentially, in Perl. But even here, you have your HTML embedded inside a Perl program, and it's abstracted away, so it doesn't really look like HTML. Right? You have H1 and P and things like that. I wasn't very happy with that. I wanted to separate out the display from the business logic. So by '94, I had taken all my C code that I had written over the years and built some core libraries, and I put a very simple templating system on top of that, so that this same example now looked like this. It looked like HTML with just a couple of interesting tags in it. And this is where things like register globals came from. To write their business logic in the templating language. And they kept complaining that the templating language wasn't very good. It's like, of course it's not a very good language. It's just a templating system. It's not a language. The language is C. Write your business logic in C. It's a compiled, strongly typed, solid language for writing business logic. Why would you want to write business logic in this crappy templating system? And I tried and I tried and I tried for years to explain to people, you want a strongly typed, compiled language for your business logic. And everyone kept saying, no, 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 no. We want a crappy templating system for writing our business logic. Okay. And I think the reason for that was the timing. The web between 1993 and 1997 exploded like crazy. The number of servers out there would double every couple of weeks on the web. The number of developers available and with experience to actually write this stuff was nowhere near meeting the demand that people had. So all kinds of people were looking for shortcuts. And they saw this templating system, this PHP templating system, as the shortcut for how they could very, very quickly crank out sites, and they would just use the existing example, basically. I had provided a whole bunch of example applications with some example tags to show how you would do it. And they would just use that business logic that I had already written and then write their site in that and then complain when some of the stuff was missing. And that was the first 5-6 years of PHP, was people complaining, saying, hi, why is there no, why can't I recurse from within a template section, for example? It's like, why would you need recursion in a templating system? And all these things just kept. And then I looked at the code and I could say, okay, well, I can add recursion, but I didn't have static variables, so there was no way to end the recursion. But I could say, yes, there is recursion. It'll just recurse forever. Not my fault. But that was the basis for PHP. And that's why we've had some issues over the years, because the original intent was nowhere near where we ended up, which I realize happens all the time when you start off something in one direction and then it ends up going in a different direction. So, around the same time, I was solving web problems. I wasn't building a language. I have no idea how to write a scripting language. No clue. I kind of accidentally stumbled into it because I wrote a templating system, and then I slowly added things to it so it looked like a language, kind of. But my real thing was solving web problems. And I needed a database for many of my applications. I couldn't afford to buy Oracle. Back then, there was Postgres 95, which was terrible. It would crash all the time. Postgres in 1994 just wasn't there. MySQL wasn't around. This was before MySQL. But I found a tiny little database called MSQL, or Mini SQL, written by a guy named David Hughes in Australia. And it was great. It was very small. It didn't have a whole bunch of complicated SQL features, but for normal web apps, it was fine. But the computers at the time were pretty slow. They didn't have much memory. My server, I remember, I had a huge server. It had 32 megs of memory. Most home PCs at the time had about 8 megs of memory. Right? You didn't have 100 meg Ethernet back then. Everything was 10 meg Ethernet. And the amount of data your web app had to pass through and deal with wasn't necessarily any smaller. I was doing an application for the University of Toronto to manage the dial-up pool for students and faculty to get online. And the University of Toronto had just as many students in 1994 and 95 as they do now. So the amount of people hitting this thing and logging in and doing stuff was the same as now. It's not like we had less data back then. We just had much less powerful computers to handle it. And one of the problems that I hit was when I did a select star from logins, because I had an administrative page that showed the logins to the system. After a while, there were hundreds of thousands of records in this database. And if I just did a select star, then I had to sit and wait for all the data to come across the socket. And the latency on my web applications was getting into 20, 30 seconds because it was just sitting there reading. And then I show the first 15 results on the page and throw away the other 995,000 results that came across the wire. That just didn't work. I needed a way to shortcut this. So this is from the changelog for Mini SQL from October 1995. And if you look closely in here, there's a line that says, merged in the limit patch from Rasmus. So I had to hack the database, and I needed a way to limit the amount of information that came across the wire. So I hacked in this limit statement. I hadn't heard of cursors at all, because Mini SQL didn't have cursors, and I had never read the ANSI SQL standard. I got a ton of hate mail for the next 20 years from all kinds of database geeks. It's like, what the hell were you thinking when you added limit to Mini SQL? Because then limit ended up going into MySQL, which is another interesting story. PHP with Mini SQL was doing quite well. And then I got an email from David Axmark, who's one of the founders of MySQL. And they were trying to get MySQL off the ground. And he was asking me, what would it take to add MySQL support to PHP? I don't know, I'll have to take a look at it, see how hard it is. It's like, but we've made it really, really easy for you. We have cloned the Mini SQL API. So all you have to do is a search and replace in the PHP code from MSQL to MySQL, and it'll compile, we promise you. I said, well, are you also SQL compatible? We have this limit clause that lots of PHP people use. It's like, we'll add that. Okay. So that's where the limit clause came from. So even if you're not a PHP person, I bet you've still used PHP-derived stuff like limit in your SQL. All right. I get bored of talking about 20 years ago. So now, some 24 years later, I guess, 23 years later, we're on PHP 7. The big deal, for me at least, about PHP 7 is the speed. We had some magic occur, which I bet Nikita will tell you a bit about later on today, where they were able to reduce the amount of memory that PHP 7 moves around internally, which caused a surprisingly large performance increase. People always ask me, is it a JIT? Like, no, it's not a JIT. It was actually one of the steps towards getting to a JIT. Dimitri wrote a JIT, but it wasn't really doing any real-world performance increases on things like WordPress and Drupal and things. So he tabled the JIT for a while and went back and looked at what else can we do. And Dimitri, Chen Chen in China, Nikita mostly, hacked away at this code for over a year to try to reduce the amount of memory so they could get back to working on the JIT. But simply the step of reducing memory caused this massive performance increase. So everyone decided, let's release this and let's not wait for the JIT, because even without the JIT, we're way, way faster. So some of the things that were done: decrease the overall data, of course, and also make sure that the right data is in the right memory registers. And some really interesting optimizations. This is my favorite, I think. Because we added opcache back in PHP 5.5, we have now been able to make use of the fact that we know we have opcache available, and we can start caching things from the application in shared memory. So this silly example that creates 100,000 arrays, so an array of 100,000 other arrays, in PHP 5 takes 109 megabytes. In PHP 7, just because the data structures are smaller, without opcache, it takes 42 megabytes of memory. But you turn on opcache, and it drops to 6 on a per-process basis. So we've dropped from 109 megabytes of memory down to 6, which is a massive, massive decrease in memory usage. And a whole bunch of other micro-optimizations were done as well. The JIT project isn't dead. It's still being worked on. I don't know when we'll see it. It's still not providing any significant real-world speedups. If you're doing image processing in PHP, or if you're creating fractals, yes, the JIT helps you. Not that many people do that kind of work in PHP, and they shouldn't do that kind of work in PHP, at least not until we have the JIT. But in the real world, the amount of change that happened there, and it's quite incredible, actually, if you think about it, because this was in 2015 that suddenly we had a 2x jump in performance. So you can compile PHP yourself, and you can do make prof gen. That generates a profiling version of PHP. You can then teach your PHP what kind of code it will be running. The easiest way to do that is to run PHP CGI minus T. So this repeats this command 1,000 times. So here it's the front page of WordPress. And WordPress loads in everything from the front page, so you basically get the entire app. But you can teach on many URLs as well. For WordPress, you just need one. Once you've taught your PHP, Then you recompile, you say make prof clean, and then prof use, says use this profiling data that we collected. And now you have a PHP that is tuned specifically for WordPress. And you saw that you got a slight increase here from about 504 requests per second to 540 on my test server. So 7–8% increase in performance. And people say that's a crazy thing to do, but if you're a WordPress shop, you just run WordPress, why wouldn't you? Or if you just run a single application, why wouldn't you tune your binary for that application? Even more important, I think, is memory use, that it's dropped significantly. For WordPress, if you're still running 5.3, it takes about 140 megs of memory per process in this case. This is measured across 10 PHP FPM processes running under Nginx, and each one takes about 140 megs in PHP 5.3, which is crazy. In PHP 7, it dropped to 15. So almost 10 times less memory is needed to run WordPress in PHP 7. At Etsy, we made this migration 2 years ago. This is latency. So 95th percentile latency. It dropped from about 470 milliseconds to about 270 milliseconds. So we shaved off 200 milliseconds. User CPU as well. So the amount of CPU required to serve up these requests dropped about in half. And lastly, memory use dropped a ton, from about 80 megs down to 12 megs. The real-world effect of this is that I was able to turn off, at least during testing, I was able to turn off about 2/3 of all our production servers. That's a huge deal. It sure made our ops people nervous as I started doing this, because I'd turn off 10 servers, remove them from the load balancer. And I was like, that didn't affect it. Let's take out 25. Another 25 out. And I kept going until I had taken 2/3 of all our servers out. At that point, the performance was dropping a bit at that point, and it was getting down close to PHP 5 levels. So I was still faster than what I was upgrading from, but I wasn't at PHP 7 levels anymore at 2/3. So in the end, I ended up turning some back on because I wanted the PHP 7 levels, but we were able to turn off almost half our servers because of this upgrade. And if you take this and apply it to the whole world, the thing I had earlier on the slide about saving the planet, and PHP is on at least half, probably more, but at least half of them. So we're just around 5% adoption of PHP 7 today, which is too low. But it still means it's on about 250,000 physical servers. If you do a little bit of math on that, that translates to, well, this is what each server will need. And at 5% adoption, it means we're saving about $200 million. US dollars, 750 million kilowatt hours, which translates to about 375 million less kilograms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. At 100%, That's significant. So, everyone in the room, if for no other reason, please upgrade to PHP 7, especially if you have kids. All right, how am I doing on time? Okay, so this year's PHP 7.1, well, it was actually released last year, but the current version of PHP 7 is PHP 7.1. How many people in here are already running PHP 7? Wow, not bad. That's probably about a third of the room. Not bad, not bad. So some of the new things in PHP 7.1, there's a void return type. So you can mark things as returning void. It's still internally behind the scenes actually returns null, but by stating that it should be returning void, static analyzers and other things can catch mistakes easier. It doesn't actually change the functionality of the code itself. There's also nullable types now. So if you put a question mark before the type hint, you can say this can be int or null in this case, which can be useful. And that works both for parameters going into functions and methods, and also for the returned type. So on the return type here, you can also say this can either return an integer or null. There's an iterable pseudo type as well, where you can state that this thing is something that you can iterate across. So arrays, objects with array access, things like that. You can now do negative string offsets. So positive string offsets count from the beginning of the string, negative counts from the end of the string and back. And you can do keys. You can basically leave out the list part, so you have this shortcut. This one has been an interesting. There's an added warning that warns you if you're trying to add non-numeric strings together. And at least in the Etsy code base, what that turned up was a whole bunch of people who confused JavaScript and PHP string concatenation. Because in JavaScript, to concatenate two strings, you use a plus. In PHP, when you use a plus, it's a mathematical operation, and PHP tries to coerce the arguments into an integer, and then it mathematically adds the two. And this warning has surfaced many places in this big legacy code base where people were adding strings thinking they would be concatenated together. So it's actually been catching quite a lot of bugs at Etsy.
Will it result in 15?
Will it result in what? This will be 15. Number of apples will be apples in there. Yes. So the numerical plus in this case will be 10 plus 5, and the result will be 15. The other pieces will be thrown away. Now, if it didn't have a number, if it was just apples plus pears, it would be 0. Right? Class constant visibility, you can add the visibility keywords to constants now as well. There aren't a whole lot of things that will break your code if you're already on PHP 7.0. There are a couple of new keywords. If you have a class named void, that will break. Rename it. Rand and srand are now actually just aliases for the empty rand and empty srand. So that could break your code if you have some tests that uses a known seed, for example, and you expect that seed to generate a certain series of random numbers. you'll now get a different set of random numbers from that same seed. It's not a huge breakage, but it could break some tests, so you should be aware of that. And also, even if you were using MT-RAND before, there was a bug in the Mersenne twister that was fixed, so it generates, even Mersenne itself generates a different set of random numbers now. Also, if you call a function with too few arguments, this is now an error, another warning. Hopefully the warnings caused you to fix it in PHP 7.0. If it didn't, now it will break, and now you have to fix it. And yes, some security-related stuff. SSL v2 has been dropped, and mcrypt. Mcrypt is an encryption library which hasn't been updated by its authors for, I think, 8 years now, which is a bad thing in the encryption world. And you shouldn't be using it anymore. If you still are, you're going to have to fix that before you can get onto PHP 7.1. One of the projects I've been working on, and I started this thing about 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, called FAN, which is a static analysis tool. The main reason I started it was to get Etsy from PHP 5 to PHP 7. It was a migration tool that would help us check the code and catch not just incompatible code, but also fix dumb mistakes. So one of the things it caught like 3 times was this mistake here. And I bet half of you don't even see what the mistake is in that code, because it looks okay, right? So, but if you look carefully, what are we counting? Right? This person obviously meant to put the brace here. Count if count A is greater than 1, not if count of A is greater than 1, right? Which would never be true in this case. So it catches this, where it's saying, here's a comparison from array to int. So you're directly doing a comparison of an array to an integer, which is probably not what you meant. It's perfectly legal PHP code to do this, but chances are it's a bug. So other things FAN can catch is PHP doc comments that are wrong. So in this case, we're saying that this test function takes a string argument. And then we're assigning that string argument to this property, which we've defined to be an integer, right? So we say the property should be an integer, but then we pass in a string and we assign it. And FAN catches 2 problems here. It says on line 10, we're assigning a string to a property that is actually int. Then on line 11, because we said that this function is supposed to return an integer, and we're returning a string, it's saying that, hey, you have the wrong return type as well. We run this FAN tool on every push into production from Etsy. So we run all the unit tests, but we also run FAN against the code to make sure that mistakes like this don't get into production. It can also help with refactoring. You could mark something as deprecated, and then you can very quickly get all the callers, because it'll give you an error every time somebody is trying to call the deprecated function. Now, if it's okay that some places still call it, there's also a thing that's called @suppress, and you can say, at this point, suppress this error. I know I need to fix this, but I'll come back to it later. I know about it, it's okay, ignore it. To use it, you can install it with Composer. So Composer require dev Etsy fan. The best way to then run it on your own project is to create a little config file in .fan. So .fan config.php, where you can set a few different things. You can tell it about your directory structure, for example. And you can say, don't analyze anything in vendor. it'll still load it in so it knows about all the classes and everything in there, but it won't show you errors in other people's code. Now, just for fun, you can also analyze the vendor code, and it'll light up like a Christmas tree. And you can file bugs and stuff, but chances are you're most concerned about your own code. And then once you've created this little config file, you just run vendor bin fan, and it'll scan your code and tell you how you're doing. Don't get too depressed the first time you run it, because it'll yell at you a lot. But if you do it regularly, you can keep your code nice and clean. One use of it, I think, a lot of people have been asking me, how do we use strict types in PHP 7? They've tried. They've added declare strict types to the top of their stuff, and it just gives them a whole bunch of runtime errors, which they're not happy about, because a production runtime error sucks. It affects users, and even though you can do it file by file, it's still hard to get there. So if you have legacy code that looks something like this, and you try to get directly to strict types, right? You declare strict types, and you add in type hints everywhere, it's going to come up, and it's going to complain right away that you're actually passing in a Boolean there. I think a better halfway step is to add soft types. So go in via PHP doc types, which fan also reads. So these are just comments. It's not actually going to break your code in production, but it'll let you see, if I were to add all these types everywhere, what's going to break. You run fan across it, and then clean up all the fan errors. And then, slowly, you can start moving them from soft types to hard types as you go through it. I think that's a more realistic way of getting to strict types, if that's your goal. So, let's see. Yes, I've left a little bit of time for questions. But again, the slides are here. Talks, php.net, PHPKonf. We have a microphone ready for questions.
Arkadaşlar, sorusu olan arkadaşları kürsünün önünde bu tarafa alalım. Buradan sırayla soralım. In case you have questions directed to Mr. Rasmus, we'd like you to come to right here to ask your questions in person. Kimse sorusu yok mu?
Or yell them out, I'll repeat them.
Ne var?
Why is strict type equals to 1 while it should be Boolean? It should say true. The whole story of this is to follow the strict types, and it equals 1.
Yes, so the answer, we do recognize the irony that that's not a Boolean there. The idea was to keep it shorter, not to force people to write out true every time and just stick in a 1. Yeah, it's a minor thing. But yes, I understand.
And another question,
Okay.
You mentioned WordPress and Drupal as like main applications that are using PHP. And what do you think about WordPress and its code base and the security issues with it?
So I'm probably the wrong person to ask about WordPress security. I have run WordPress myself. I don't find the code all that insecure. Most of the problems are in strange plugins that you download and you don't update. If you're running core WordPress and you keep it up to date, you're fine. If you download random plugins from who knows where and install them, you're not so fine.
But it was like in endpoint in API. Like
Yeah, but those get fixed quickly, right? They get reported and they get fixed. All code is insecure. There's no such thing as secure code. It's just a matter of how fast do the authors react, how quickly do they fix it, and do users update. WordPress is not slow about fixing their security issues. So to me, WordPress is not an insecure application. You hear about it a lot because it's installed everywhere. Everyone uses it. You hear about Microsoft Windows security problems Not necessarily because it's any worse, but just because so many more people use it, right? You take any technology and you give it the scope of something like PHP, Windows, or WordPress, you're going to hear about security problems in it. You don't hear about stuff nobody uses. And that doesn't mean it's secure, it just means nobody cares.
When do you expect PHP 7 to be totally supported by servers?
To be totally supported by what?
By worldwide servers. And also Laravel and the E2, are they supporting these features?
Okay, so basically you're asking when will applications start making use of some of this stuff? That's going to be a while. The problem is that, for example, I think for WordPress, the minimum required PHP version is 5.2, which is crazy. And still for Laravel and others, they're still letting you use PHP 5 because we don't have enough people on 7 yet. I fully expect frameworks at some point to say minimum version 7.0, but we're not quite there yet. And until they do that, they can't start using these features because they still have to support PHP 5. So, and I know there are new versions that are coming out now, like there are in beta and will be out like this year and next year that do require PHP 7, but it's just coming now. There are none out there, I think, at least, that are requiring PHP 7. So, but it always takes it. PHP 7 has actually been getting higher adoption than going from PHP 4 to PHP 5. That was a slower adoption than PHP 5 to 7.
Also, PHP returns 1 as true and nothing for false, not 0, correct?
Right, that's, well, that's not a bug, no. That's every single programming language ever, basically. False has never been 0. I don't know any programming language where false is 0, right? If you try it in every programming language out there, it's not 0, 1, it's true and empty, essentially. Empty is false.
Feature request. Yet another feature request. Is there a plan to implement the native threading or async await like in Hacklang?
No. I think it would complicate the code base way too much to do it that way. Now, part of why PHP works so well is the fact that it's not threaded and that it's perfectly sandboxed in the sense that we break everything that we initialize and start up, we tear down at the end. So every request is discrete, which means it's perfectly scalable horizontally. Once you start adding threads within this and having multiple threads of execution, changing state within the same process, things get really, really complicated really quickly. And we don't really need it. There are so many nice services out there to send off asynchronous requests. So at Etsy, we use Gearman a lot to do all our async work. And there are all kinds of backends that you can send off and say, hey, start executing this asynchronously. Because really, your front-end web server should not be doing asynchronous processing. The front-end web server should be in and out really quickly to return results. You should have other servers. If you need to do longer running things in parallel, you should put that on a different set of servers. And if it's already on a different set of servers, there's no point starting a thread on the front-end web server. There really isn't. So unless someone comes up with a really clean way of implementing it that doesn't make the code a massive mess, I don't see it happening. Yes?
You mentioned Gearman, and it uses some background workers, right? And so is it like it's living forever?
So the question is about Gearman. How does Gearman work? It's basically just a request broker. So it's a queue of requests, and then you register what's going to handle these requests. It doesn't have to be PHP, it could be any other language. In our case at Etsy, we do have PHP processes. But it's just the broker part. It doesn't do anything. But yes, it's a daemon that sits there and takes requests and then brokers them out to the workers.
Okay, but worker, I mean, can it live
Can the worker live forever? Sure. You can write long-running PHP applications if you like. Typically, you wouldn't have a worker, like that's not what, I mean, these asynchronous requests are also discrete things. It might run for 3 days, but it's going to end at some point, like sending out all the email in the queue or something. Eventually that ends. You wouldn't write a daemon listening as a Gearman worker. That makes no sense. All right. 2 more, I think, we have time for.
Hi, I have 2 questions. First is, do you plan to add native strict type hintings for class variables?
Native strict types for class variables.
Fields. Yeah. And second is, please tell us something about your development environment, like OS or hardware, or something like this. Thanks.
So I know there's been some talk about typing class variables. Maybe. We'll see. My development environment, it's just Linux. It's all Linux. VI, Linux, GCC, Valgrind. I'm Debian everywhere. Etsy runs CentOS on their stuff, but my stuff, my laptop, my home servers, everything, my HTPC that's connected to my TV, everything is Debian on it, just because I'm used to it. These days the distributions are pretty similar, but I'm used to apt-get install, and it just works for me. Yeah.
I only want to say Symfony 4 is starting with PHP 7.1 at minimum version, and the current version of Typo 3 uses PHP 7 only too.
Cool. That's good to hear. How are we doing on time, organizers? Oh, I still have a few minutes. Okay. We have 3 minutes.
Creator of Linus Torvalds said, I don't really like getting interaction with people. What about you, sir?
He's good.
I want to, what? Sorry?
Creator of Linux, Linus Torvalds said just like that, I don't really like to get interaction with people. What about you?
He doesn't like getting interaction with people. That's not true. I know Linus quite well, actually. I've met Linus many times.
In the chat videos.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I mean, a lot of us, including people in this room, were not super social.
Of course.
I mean, you can disagree if you like, but you're lying. So in that sense, yes, he's just like the rest of us. Like, we're kind of antisocial geeks. We're more comfortable in smaller groups and not just having people everywhere. But he's a normal geek. He's no different from the rest of us. He really isn't.
Okay, thanks, sir.
There's one behind you.
First of all, welcome to Turkey.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you just one question. I'm not keeping it long. So, as everyone knows in this room, that PHP has some kind of long and at some point and weird function names and in some occasions, and there are some unexpected behaviors. And for example, sometimes we expect an exception to be thrown, but we don't get exceptions. So I just want to ask one thing. So is it PHP is going to be like a more structured language, like Python or other languages, or yeah, because for example, I'm just talking for my account. I hate to call, for example, JSON last error after I call JSON decode.
Right.
And I expect an exception to be thrown, to be honest.
All right, so I get this question all the time. This is the purity question, basically. You gave examples of Python and Ruby being consistent. Do you think the Python 2 to 3 Has
by the
gone
way,
well?
I'm not fan of Python.
Do you think the Perl 5 to Perl 6 has gone well?
I'm sorry.
So one of the things that PHP is very serious about is making backward compatibility a priority. We want to make sure that you are able to upgrade your PHP and that your code won't break completely. A few things will need to be tweaked here and there to go to the next major version, but it's not going to take you a year rewriting everything to get onto PHP 7 if you have PHP 5 code that's reasonable. And it wasn't a huge job to get from PHP 4 to PHP 5 if you had reasonable PHP 4 code. This means that we're able to bring features to people because we haven't gone back and cleaned up some of these things. And PHP is actually perfectly consistent. It's just not consistent in the way you expect. So, if I can explain that slightly. So people expect horizontal consistency across the language. The way PHP was built was for vertical consistency, in the sense that a lot of the function names and a lot of the argument orders and things came from the underlying library. Things like string comp and all the libc derived functions. And I realize a lot of people in here don't even know what libc is, which to them it appears very inconsistent. But to a C or a C++ developer, you see these function names, string p break, for example, you know exactly what this function does and what the argument order should be because, and I mean, people complain that stringling should have an underscore in it. And it's like, any C developer, their head would explode if you put, because stringling is stringling. It's set in stone. This has been around for 50 years, right? It's stringling. You cannot put an underscore in stringling. Just because other string functions have underscores, it doesn't matter. Stringling is a thing of itself. It's not string length, it's stringling. All right? And yes, old geezers like me understand that. The 21-year-old has no clue what the hell I'm talking about. But that's an example of vertical consistency, right? It's consistent from where this stuff came from. It's perfectly consistent. It's just not consistent horizontally across it. If we were to fix all these things, we would break every single piece of code out there, just so you wouldn't be annoyed every time you had to write stringling instead of string underscoreling. I don't care how annoyed you get at this stuff. It still works perfectly well. And yes, you might say, oh, I hate doing this. It doesn't make it any harder.
No, but at least we can have proper exceptions for some functions.
Yeah, but that also breaks code. For some things, you cannot use it true, because PHP didn't used to have exceptions at all. But there's a backward compatibility problem there. Then we'd have to add a flag to JSON decode, basically, and JSON encode. We'd have to add a flag, throw an exception, yes, no, right? And we have places we could do it cleanly. You'll notice that lots of things now throw exceptions in PHP 7, whereas before they were fatal errors. Like if you try to call a method on null, for example, if you have a null object or variable that's null, and you try to call a method on it, you now can catch that. You couldn't catch that in PHP 5. So there are many places where we've cleaned it up, and maybe the JSON case, maybe we can come up with a clean way of doing that. But so that the overall strategy here is we are trying to clean things up if we can do it without breaking the world. We're not going to do a Perl 6. We're just not. It's not worth it. And because if you do it, lots of people say, well, we'll just stay on the old version. And then we haven't helped anybody. That means that all the frameworks, everybody out there has to support the old version. It means they can't use the new features, and we're not moving the technology along. All right.
Hi, Rasmus. I think I'm the last question.
Last question? Okay.
I think. Last two.
Okay. Last three, maybe?
Yeah.
we're cutting into the coffee break a little bit, but all right.
All right. For the most part, I think the so-called elite developers hated PHP, and they say practically PHP is dead, and almost the PHP developers I know believed it. Do you think the 7.0 is the reborn out of ashes?
So I don't know about that. I mean, there's a very vocal minority of people that complain a lot about PHP. But then you turn around and you look at the growth of PHP over the years, and not just old sites getting bigger, but new companies popping up using PHP. The usage has not tapered off at all. Like Strostrup famously said that there are only two types of languages. Languages people complain about, and languages people don't use. Right? So in that sense, yes, of course people are going to complain about PHP. It is not cool. It is a 25-year-old language at this point, so there are lots of things to complain about. We recognize that, of course. But we also have to sort of stay true to the base of PHP, and we can't suddenly say, okay, we're going to listen to this small minority of people who keep complaining. We're going to break everything and fix everything. And then nobody's code works anymore. We can't do that, right? So the second part of your question, does PHP 7 address this? Not really. I mean, we've cleaned up a few things, but there's still lots of the same things people complain about is still in PHP 7. It's just way faster now. And now suddenly, because it's way faster, people have stopped complaining a little bit. Say, hey, PHP is cool. It's just faster at running crappy code, but that's cooler. So, but what that tells you is that it's not that important, some of these inconsistencies. If it can solve the problem really, really well, and especially now that it uses a lot less memory and runs really, really fast, people are much more able to sort of ignore the warts and the slight ugliness here and there in the code because we've made it faster. At some point, they'll come back and people will start complaining about it. Once they get used to the speed of PHP 7, they'll come back and they'll start complaining about it being ugly again. But, I mean, until people stop using PHP, it's kind of just noise that we ignore because PHP is everywhere still. Surprisingly so. Nah, there's not much. Yeah, there's still PHP GTK, but nobody's really using that. So, okay, so the question, if you didn't hear because you just shouted it out, it's about writing desktop applications in PHP. For us, it's not a focus at all. If people want to, they can. We are focused on the web. We're focused on web applications and web-related things. We're not going to do anything specific in the core PHP to support mobile or desktop development environments. All right, was that the last one?
Yeah, that was the last one.
That was the last one? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.